On an unusually dark evening, the moon hung low, casting eerie shadows against the skeletal trees that lined the street. The wind whispered through the leaves, sounding like soft voices sharing secrets of the unknown. It was a night that felt like it belonged in a horror movie, a night where anything seemed possible. For 16-year-old Clara, it was the beginning of what she expected to be a simple babysitting job. Little did she know, this night would be unlike any other. At the end of a long, winding road, Clara stood before a sprawling, old Victorian house. The wind rustled the trees, and the house loomed like a giant from a fairy tale, but one that was not very friendly. Its peeling paint and jagged edges looked more intimidating than quaint, especially under the moonlight that was only slightly illuminated by scattered clouds. Clara felt a chill run down her spine, as if the house itself had eyes, watching her with many windows that stared like haunting eyes into her very soul. Clara approached the door, feeling an electric thrill of both fear and excitement. She rang the doorbell, and the sound echoed far too loudly in the stillness of the night. It created an unsettling rhythm that made her heart race. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Hawthorne, the children's mother. Her face was drawn and weary, as if she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Clara immediately noticed the worry lines that etched deep into her forehead. "The kids are already in bed, but you might hear some strange noises. This house has its quirks," she added, trying to smile, but it looked forced. She chuckled softly, but that unsettling sound sent another shiver down Clara's spine. After exchanging a few awkward words, Mrs. Hawthorne handed Clara a slip of paper with the number for the pizza place and an ancient-looking cordless phone. Its buttons were worn down from years of use, which made Clara think that the phone had stories of its own to tell. She watched Mrs. Hawthorne hesitate at the door, her eyes scanning the dark street as if she was searching for something hidden in the shadows, something that might not want to be seen. A sudden thought crossed Clara's mind. Did Mrs. Hawthorne feel uneasy, too? "Just keep them safe," Mrs. Hawthorne whispered with a sense of urgency before she turned and disappeared into the night. The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that felt heavy. Clara took a deep breath, trying to calm the fluttering in her stomach, and glanced around the dimly lit hallway. The atmosphere felt thick, as if the house itself was breathing, waiting. The children, two rambunctious boys named Ethan and Max, were tucked away upstairs, their soft breaths mingling with the occasional creaks of the old house. Clara settled into the musty living room, where the air smelled like dust and old furniture. She flipped on the television, hoping that the flickering images would distract her from the nervousness bubbling inside. But the flickering images on the screen barely held her attention. Her mind buzzed with thoughts of homework, friends, and plans for the weekend, but the unsettling atmosphere wrapped around her like a dense fog. Clara's thoughts were interrupted when the old phone rang, shattering the quiet with a shrill sound. Clara jumped, her heart pounding in her chest, as she wondered who could possibly be calling at this hour. Instinctively, she reached for the ancient phone, her fingers trembling as she pressed the green button. "Hello," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite how she felt inside, as if her heart was trying to escape from her chest. "Is your refrigerator running?" a guttural voice hissed through the line. There was something deeply sinister in the tone, something that made Clara's skin crawl. Startled by the strange call, she laughed, trying to convince herself that it was just a prank. "Very funny. Who is this?" she retorted, attempting to sound braver than she truly felt. But instead of a response, the voice cackled menacingly before hanging up. An uneasy feeling curled in her stomach, but she brushed it off, convincing herself it was just the creepy vibes of the house getting to her. As time passed, Clara realized the night felt increasingly claustrophobic. The calls continued, each one more sinister than the last. The same voice returned time and again, echoing in her ears. Each whisper seemed designed to poke at her fears, tying knots of dread deeper in her mind. "Are you alone, Clara?" it would ask with a low hiss. "What's that behind you?" The chilling sounds sent waves of panic coursing through her veins, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder every few minutes, expecting to find someone, or something, lurking there. To distract herself from the growing fears, Clara decided to check on the boys. She tiptoed up the stairs, her footsteps barely making a sound against the old wooden floor. Each step felt like a test, as she could hear the shadows rising around her, clinging to the corners of the house. The dim hallway stretched out before her, and its shadowy corners felt even more suffocating than before. When she finally reached the boys' room, their bedroom door creaked open, revealing Ethan and Max sleeping soundly. Their small, innocent faces illuminated the dark room like tiny beacons of peace. As Clara looked at them, a flicker of comfort warmed her. At least they were safe, she thought. But the moment she turned to leave, she caught the faintest hint of movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadow? Or was it just her imagination playing tricks? She blinked, bewildered, but when she looked again, there was nothing there. She shook her head, trying to clear the creeping feeling that something was wrong. Returning to the living room, an unease settled over her like a heavy blanket. She tried once more to focus on the flickering screen of the television. Suddenly, the phone rang again, its shrill sound nauseating against the eerie stillness of the house. Sitting up straight, Clara felt the dread creeping once more into her gut. She hesitated for just a moment, pulling herself together before answering. "Why are you still there, Clara?" The voice rasped, low and menacing, as if it were slithering into her thoughts. "Are you ready for the real fun?" The weight of those words hung in the air and echoed in Clara's ears. She could feel the blood drain from her face. "Who are you?" she cried, her heart racing wildly. The terror washed over her like icy waves crashing against the shore. Silence followed her desperate question as the line suddenly fell dead quiet. Clara gripped the phone tightly, its plastic body cold and unyielding. She could no longer ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house, with its sad, broken windows and warped doors, now loomed over her like a dark curtain closing in, hiding secrets she wasn't ready to unveil. The weight of the night settled heavily on her shoulders, an invisible burden she felt pressing against her chest. A chill swept through the living room, and Clara's breath came out in white puffs as fear tightened around her. Determined to confront her fears, she gathered her courage and gave the television screen one last glance before she decided to turn it off. She told herself that it was just a harmless prank, and repeating that mantra helped her stand in the dark. The thought raced through her mind that it was either the night playing tricks on her or something much more sinister lurking in the shadows. Suddenly, there was a loud thud that reverberated from upstairs, making Clara jump and gasp aloud. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, to run out of the house and into the cool embrace of the night. Yet, she felt an undeniable compulsion to see what had caused the sound. Maybe one of the boys was awake. Perhaps they had fallen out of bed. Whatever the case, an uneasy blend of dread and curiosity propelled her forward, step by slow step, until she reached the boys' room again. Peering inside, Clara noticed that they were still fast asleep, their chests rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. Their faces, soft and peaceful, brought her comfort, and she felt a flutter of relief sweep over her. Yet, a lingering sense of wrongness lingered in the air, oppressive and suffocating. Clara decided she needed to check out the strange noises for herself before fear could escalate any further. She held her breath as she listened intently, the silence of the house pressing against her ears. The thud that had startled her echoed faintly across the hall, and she couldn't help but wonder what had caused it. Clara crept slowly down the hallway, her heart thumping loudly in her chest, each step feeling like it took an eternity. As she moved, she could almost hear the whispers of the wind outside merging with her own thoughts, growing louder in her mind. Just a little further, she whispered to herself like a comforting mantra. "Just check it out, and then you can go back to watching TV." The shadowy corners felt alive, waiting to engulf her in darkness, but Clara pushed on, determined to uncover whatever mystery lay hidden behind those walls. With every inch she took, her courage wavered. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, and every sound reverberated against the silence. Clara paused outside the bathroom, her palms sweaty against the cool wall. She held her breath as another soft sound floated down the hallway. Was it footsteps, a creak of the floorboards? Or was it all in her imagination? Gathering all her strength, Clara peeked into the small room, half expecting a monster to leap out at her. The bathroom was dim but empty. Just as Clara sighed with relief, they noticed the mirror. It was fogged up, and as she stepped close, she could see her reflection staring back at her wide-eyed and pale. There was something about the fog. It seemed to swirl almost on its own, and for a moment, Clara felt her heart threaten to slam out of her chest. Suddenly, she caught sight of something. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, a darker shadow lurking beyond its threshold. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Should she explore? Her heart was foreboding, yet the urge to discover what lay beyond was overpowering. She knew she had to find out. With resolve, Clara walked toward the attic door, each step filled with anticipation and fear. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. Grabbing it tightly, she pushed it open, the creaking sound echoing eerily in the stillness. A gust of cold air escaped from the attic, brushing against her snug fit, sending another shiver racing through her. Inside, it was dark, and she hesitated. As she flicked on the small light switch, the dim bulb hung like a waning star, illuminating a sea of cobwebs and dusty old boxes. Clara could barely see the outline of furniture covered in white sheets, resembling ghosts ready to haunt her. The attic was filled with long-forgotten treasures and neglected memories that should have been left undisturbed. But the strange noises pulled her further in, like a siren to a sailor lost at sea. She approached the nearest box, her heart pounding. What could it be? As she reached to pull off the cover, just then a freezing wind howled through the attic, causing the sheets to flutter and the boxes to rattle. Clara gasped, stepping back, fear flooding through her again. "Is anyone there?" she called out, her voice echoing off the wooden beams above. She almost expected to see someone step from behind a box, a haunting figure glowing in the shadows, but nothing moved. Just silence, broken only by the howling wind. After a moment, she mustered the courage to continue exploring the attic, searching for the source of the sounds that had drawn her here. She stumbled upon an old trunk covered with dust and cobwebs. Clara opened it, her heart racing in anticipation. Inside were faded photographs, yellowed with age, a glimpse into a life long forgotten. Her fingers brushed over them, revealing smiling faces, children playing, and scenes of family gatherings. But as she looked closer, something inexplicable gripped her. The last photo was different. It was a picture of two boys, strikingly similar to Ethan and Max. But the boys looked around Clara's age, older than Ethan and Max, but eerily familiar. She felt strange about the faces that mirrored the boys she was babysitting. Suddenly, an odd noise echoed through the silence again, bringing her back to the present. With trepidation, Clara turned toward the noise, a mix of curiosity and dread coursing through her veins. She could feel something lurking in the corners, something that made her skin prickle. Fear squeezed her hard again as the whispers of the wind turned into agonizing voices, beckoning her to run. The past secrets of this house seemed to be wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into its narrative. Clara realized that this night was no longer just about her babysitting job. It was about uncovering something ancient and perhaps dangerous. Something hidden that did not want to remain a secret for long. With every ounce of bravery she could muster, Clara knew she needed to uncover the truth of this house before it swallowed her whole. She took a deep breath, filled with resolve, stepping back toward the doorway, leaving the old trunk behind, its stories suddenly feeling more important than ever. As she returned down the stairs, her mind raced with thoughts of the boys upstairs and the nighttime stretching ahead of her. What awaited her in the shadows? Little did she know, the night had only just begun. The heavy darkness of the hallway felt alive as Clara stepped back into it. It was as if the shadows themselves were whispering secrets, secrets she couldn't quite understand, but they made her stomach flip like she had just fallen off a swing. Somewhere, in the depths of that shadowy abyss, something was watching her. She didn't know what it was, but anxiety wrapped around her like a tight, uncomfortable blanket, heavy and suffocating. Despite the fear swarming around her, like a thick, dark fog, there was also an insistent push drawing her toward the staircase. As she placed each foot on the creaky steps, the sound echoed loudly, breaking the eerie silence of the house. Her heart raced, thumping against her ribs like a startled rabbit. What was that sound? A creak from the floorboards? Or maybe something else? She tried to shake the thoughts away, but fear gripped her tighter with every step she took. It felt like the walls were closing in around her, and she was trapped in a ghostly presence that kept impossible secrets. Finally, when she reached the top of the stairs, Clara found herself standing outside the bathroom, the source of the strange thud she had heard. A trickle of sweat slid down her brow as she knocked gently on the door, her knuckles pale as they connected with the jagged, battered wood. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" she called out, her voice trembling like a tiny leaf in the wind, filled with uncertainty. She listened carefully, hoping for a reply, but only silence answered her, unsettling and cold. The only sounds that filled the air were her own breath and the rapid beating of her heart. The doorknob turned painfully slowly beneath her fingers, each movement sending shivers up her spine. Clara pushed the door open, half expecting to find something grotesque and terrifying waiting for her. Instead, the bathroom was empty, except for the dim light flickering above her, casting strange shadows that danced against the walls, creating bizarre creatures that seemed to come to life in the gloom. She turned her head to the mirror, half expecting to see something lurking behind her, a twisted figure waiting to pounce. But there was only her reflection staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes that shimmered with fear. Clara felt as though the mirror held more darkness than the room. Just when she thought about turning to leave, a fleeting memory flickered in her mind. Mrs. Hawthorne's words about the house's quirks echoed through her thoughts, dragging her deeper into a sense of unease. The whole situation felt grotesque, like something out of a strange dream that she wanted desperately to wake up from. She felt woven into a mystery filled with unsettling shadows whispering all around her. Decisions swirled in her mind like leaves caught in a storm, but curiosity tangled with fear, urging her to explore even further. She took a deep breath, turned, and edged back toward the stairs, her heart racing in her chest like a trapped animal desperate to escape. Just as Clara started to descend, the phone rang again, its shrill sound ricocheting through the empty rooms, slicing through the tense silence like a knife. She hesitated, fear curling tight in her chest as she glanced at the living room below. What if it was the same voice? What if it was worse? But curiosity once again won out, overpowering the fear that had tightened its grip around her heart. She hastily returned to the living room, snatching the phone almost too quickly, nearly breathing a sigh of relief in anticipation of reassuring silence. "Hello?" she answered, breathless, each word escaping as if it were a question in itself. "Clara, why are you afraid? You know where I am," the voice on the line crooned, thick with malice and dripping with darkness. "Right behind you." The words sent a chilling wave so deep it felt like ice in her veins. Clara whipped around, her heart pounding louder than ever, half expecting to see something monstrous lurking in the shadows. The house, with its dark corners and oppressive silence, suddenly felt alive, its walls pulsing with the weight of her fears. "Stop it," Clara shouted, her voice a mixture of fury and fear. "Who are you?" But abruptly, the line dropped dead again, plunging her heart further into an abyss of terror. The air around her thickened. Everything felt wrong, slinking like shadows in the corners of her mind. It wasn't just a prank, it was a game, a wicked game, and she was the unwitting target. With trembling fingers, she set the phone down, the reality of the situation crashing down on her like jagged rocks in a stormy sea. Suddenly, the walls felt tighter, and the air thicker, as if the house itself were trying to swallow her whole. She peeped out the window, hoping for a slice of reassurance, but there was nothing but the oppressive blackness of the night. Clara pulled away from the window and sank onto the couch, feeling utterly trapped as if the shadows wanted to ensnare her in their grasp. The boys were sleeping soundly upstairs, but were they safe? This thought gnawed at her heart, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was tormenting her might already be far too close, hiding just out of sight. Time seemed to stretch on, dragging like heavy chains, and every creak of the house sent thrilling shivers racing down her spine, mixing exhilaration with horror like a terrible potion in her veins. As moments turned into hours, or so it felt, her desperation grew with each passing second. The air felt thick and impossibly heavier, an unseen terror filling every shadowy corner of the living room. Clara clenched her fists tightly, wrestling with the primal urge to run, to flee the tightening noose of fear that pulsed around her. Moments felt like an eternity until the oppressive silence was shattered once more by the haunting ring of the phone. Clara lunged for it, desperate for any form of communication or reassurance, but as she answered, her voice cracked, panic surging through her already fraying composure. "What do you want from me?" she gasped. "Funny you should ask," the voice hissed, dripping with malicious glee. "You will find out very soon. The game is just beginning." Laughter echoed diabolically through the receiver, twisting her stomach into knots as it reverberated in her ears, turning her insides to ice. The ominous silence that fell afterward felt like a heavy stone dropped into her heart, making her feel as if she had been pushed into a dark pit, alone and scared, left to crawl her way out. Clara held the phone with shaky hands, the petrifying realization crashing down upon her like a tidal wave. The darkness wasn't just a haunting presence, it was stalking her, luring her closer to something unholy and terrifying that she hadn't prepared for. It was as if this unknown entity slithered closer with every passing moment, creeping into her thoughts, planting seeds of dread. Surely, she needed to keep the boys safe, but how could she protect them when she couldn't even protect herself from whatever was lurking in the gloom? Clara glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The witching hour, the time when shadows danced freely and unholy spirits roamed among the living. With a renewed sense of purpose mixed with dread, she decided to check on the boys again. She crept back upstairs, each step feeling like an uphill battle against an invisible force, a sinister presence that schemed to keep her from escaping. As she reached their room, the atmosphere shifted, an unsettling chill swept over her, pressing down on her like a heavy weight. The air felt thick with a tangled tension, making her heart race even faster. She opened the door slowly and stepped inside. Everything looked normal at first glance. The boys were tucked snugly in their blankets, but as she approached their beds, her heart sank deeper into her chest. They seemed too peaceful, too still, a sense of dread pooling in her stomach. Clara knelt down beside Ethan, the older of the two, shaking him gently at first. "Ethan, wake up, please," she whispered urgently, her voice barely breaking through the heavy silence. There was no response, nothing, not even a stir. Panic prickled at Clara's skin, sending chills through her body like ice-cold fingers. Frantically, she moved to Max, shaking him more urgently now, desperately seeking any sign of life. If some malevolent force had crept into the house, it had taken everything from her. Clara's heart thudded sickeningly, every beat echoing her rising panic. With trembling fingers, she felt for their pulses, relief flooding through her heart when she felt the soft flutter of life beneath her fingertips. But just then, a low, dreadful sound echoed from the area behind her, an unsettling thing that rattled the very core of her being. The shadows themselves seemed to stretch and grasp at her like twisted fingernails made of nightmares. Clara turned quickly, her heart racing, her hair standing on end, the dread pooling heavily in her stomach. Something was wrong. Far more horrible than a simple prank was at play. As she glanced around the room, searching for the source of the sound, it became clear that she had stepped into a realm of darkness that promised no safety and no hope. "Stay calm," Clara whispered softly to herself, although she barely believed it. She didn't know where the sinister sound had come from, but it felt like the house itself was breathing, each creak and groan a sigh echoing with ancient secrets. She could feel the walls leaning inward, as if the house were a great beast waiting to swallow her whole. Clara's thoughts raced wildly, and she couldn't help but feel the hair on the back of her neck stand up, as if she were being watched by unseen eyes in the dark. Summoning her courage, Clara moved gradually toward the doorway, keeping an eye on her little brothers. She had to protect them. Mustering all her strength, she whispered, "You're safe," her voice shaky. "I'm here." The words resonated with her, anchoring her in the chaos. But even as she spoke, she felt as though the very shadows of the room were mocking her brave attempt at reassurance. Clara carefully stepped back toward the children, determined to keep them safe, but the oppressive shadows grew longer with each flicker of the light. She could almost hear them whispering dark secrets just out of reach. Suddenly, she spotted movement from the corner of her eye, something swirling just beyond the edges of her vision. Her heart raced faster than a hummingbird's wings as she turned, searching. A cold sweat trickled down her back. "Who's there?" Clara called, her voice steady but deep down. Her heart was pounding like a drum in her chest. The room echoed back her words with eerie silence, but she knew she wasn't alone. An ice-cold breeze swept through the room, chilling her bones and freezing her in place. Just moments ago, it felt as if the air was thick and heavy, but now it felt alive, wrapping around her like a cold hand. Then, suddenly, all the lights flickered and dimmed, plunging her deeper into darkness that felt truly endless. Clara's breath hitched in her throat, her mind racing with thoughts a young girl shouldn't have to confront. What was happening? Was it just her imagination, or was something truly sinister lurking in the shadows? "Think, Clara, think," she told herself, her voice a whisper against the oppressive silence. She felt her heart racing, getting ready to beat right out of her chest. Whatever was hiding in the dark wanted her to feel scared, it wanted to play its wicked game. But Clara wasn't going to let it win. Taking one last glance at her brothers, to ensure they were safe, she turned and made a swift decision. She needed to find a light. She thought of the flashlights they had kept in a drawer in the living room. They were small, but they could cut through the darkness, and they could make her feel safer. With her heart pounding, she hurried back to the door, ready to face the shadows that lay beyond. In that moment, Clara felt brave, like a knight gearing up to fight a dragon lurking only steps away. The shadows might be alive, but she refused to let them take control. With a deep breath, she stepped out into the darkened hallway, determined to reclaim the safety of her home and her family, even while knowing the darkness was only just beginning to whisper its dangerous secrets around her. The game was afoot, but Clara was not yet ready to be a pawn. Shivers cascaded down Clara's spine like icy droplets as she felt the malevolent force lurking, whispering ancient, evil truths into her ears. With her heart racing, she rushed back to the living room, desperate to shield herself from whatever wickedness had claimed its stake in the house. The shadows stretched ominously, twisting and turning, as if mocking her futile attempts to escape. Each flicker of the candlelight deepened the darkness, creating strange shapes that seemed to dance along the walls like phantoms enjoying a haunting masquerade. Clara grasped the phone tightly, her fingers wincing at the cold sensation of the plastic. It reminded her of the chill creeping through her bones. She gathered up her courage and dialed Mrs. Hawthorne's number. "Please answer," she whispered, almost like a prayer. Her throat felt dry as she pressed the phone against her ear, praying desperately for her employer to answer. The rasping sound of the rings echoed through the oppressive darkness, each one feeling like a countdown to something terrible. But as it went to voicemail, dread enveloped her once again. "Please, pick up, I need help," Clara breathed, her words falling out in a panic. It felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The line cut off, leaving her alone once more. It was then that she heard it, a soft, slithering sound, like a ghost creeping through the shadows, whispering secrets that no one should ever hear. She dropped the phone, clenching her hands into fists as every hair on her body stood on end, prickling like needles in the night. Clara scanned her surroundings for something, anything, she could use to defend herself. Her pulse quickened, sounding like a drumbeat against the silence. Yet, there was no comfort to be found, only the terror that threaded through the curtains, slipping through the walls, lurking just out of sight. The darkness that cloaked every corner felt alive, pulsating with an unholy energy, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. It was as if the house itself was a living organism, feeding off her fear and despair, growing stronger with each passing moment. Then, just when she thought the panic couldn't deepen, the phone rang again. The shrill sound cut through the frigid air like a knife, paralyzing Clara. Her heart was a wild animal, thumping against her ribcage as she felt like a moth drawn to a flame, needing to answer it, needing to confront the source of her dread. Steeling herself, she swallowed hard and picked up the receiver. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling with fear, every word dripping with desperation. "Oh, Clara, but I'm not alone," the voice taunted, its tone a smooth, sinister melody that made her skin crawl. "This house is mine, and soon it will be yours, too. Can't you feel it, creeping into your veins?" The words slithered into her ears, twisting around her thoughts like poisonous vines, suffocating any semblance of hope. Before she could reply, the line fell silent again, leaving her in a suffocating void of fear. Just then, a loud crash shattered the silence, a sound that reverberated from upstairs, shattering the grip of stillness that had wrapped around her like a vice. Clara froze, fear coiling tightly around her throat like a snake ready to strike. Her mind raced with questions, but one dominated her thoughts. What could it be? Whatever was happening, it was escalating beyond her understanding, feeding off her terror. The children, she had to protect the boys. They were in danger, and the weight of their safety rested squarely on her shoulders, heavy and suffocating like a wet blanket. Despite the dread coursing through her, Clara charged up the stairs, the wood creaking ominously beneath her feet as if protesting her every step. Each step felt like an act of rebellion against the growing shadows, a desperate attempt to reclaim her courage. As she reached the landing, an icy breeze seemed to sweep past her, whispering secrets of despair, urging her to turn back. But Clara pressed on, driven by love for the boys and a longing to keep them safe from whatever darkness lurked inside the house. When Clara reached their room, she hesitated at the threshold, fearful of what lay within. Her heart was pounding loudly in her ears, drowning out the sinister whispers that filled the air. What if the boys were hurt? What if something dreadful awaited her inside? Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open, her heart racing as she entered. The room looked unchanged, filled with toys scattered across the floor and the faint smell of fresh laundry, but the air felt thick with an unnatural presence, as if the walls could feel the tension building inside her. Then she noticed it, a piece of paper lying on the floor at the foot of Max's bed. Curiosity gnawed at her, overriding her instincts, and Clara knelt down to pick it up. The words were scrawled hastily, jagged and erratic, sending a wave of unease through her core. "Don't trust them," it read, "they'll come for you. They're waiting." Panic seized Clara as she realized the handwriting bore a chilling resemblance to the boys' scribbles. How could this be? Had they left a message for her? But as she read the words again, a sense of dread curled around her heart like a snake ready to strike. Who were they, and what did it mean? The shadows felt thicker in the corners of the room, twisting and gathering, feeding upon her rising fear. Suddenly, a shattering sound echoed behind her. The window had broken, sending shards of glass scattering across the wooden floor like crystals tumbling from a shattered dream. Clara's heart leapt as her instincts screamed at her to run, to escape the encroaching darkness that was now slithering into the room. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw the darkened figure lurking just outside the broken window, its form malevolent and twisted, a grotesque silhouette against the background of night. Terrified beyond reason, Clara glanced back at the boys once more. If this creature had come for them, there would be no escape. She rushed over to their beds, shaking them awake with urgency, her voice trembling with panic. "Get up, we need to go, something is here." But their faces were calm, too calm, as though they were lost in a dream, oblivious to the danger that lurked just beyond their fragile safety. "Clara, what are you doing?" Ethan murmured sleepily, his eyes fluttering open just as Clara felt a cold draft sweep over her, chilling her to her very bones. "We're not supposed to wake them." The urgency in her voice fell upon them like an unholy veil, yet their simple, innocent expressions sent waves of despair crashing over her. It was as if they couldn't see the darkness, the looming threat hovering just outside their window like a storm cloud ready to unleash chaos. "Trust me, we have to leave," she pleaded, desperation lacing her tone, hoping they'd understand the danger. At that moment, the laughter erupted again, echoing throughout the house, but this time it was joined by guttural growls and sinister whispers that danced through the shadows like a waltz, promising chaos and despair. "Clara." The voice trailed off, weaving around her like a dark shroud, a lullaby of the damned. In a moment of raw instinct, Clara grabbed both boys and pulled them toward her, her mind racing. They had to get out of the room. They had to escape whatever darkness was festering and closing in around them. But even as she moved, she could feel it, the presence creeping, thick and oppressive, coiling around them like smoke, urging them to surrender to despair. The shadows seemed eager to swallow them whole, their tendrils creeping closer, as if they could sense her fear. Clara urged the boys to their feet, the soft rugs beneath their feet suddenly feeling like chains anchoring them in place. "Come on, we have to go, we have to get out," she exclaimed, her voice cracking under the weight of her dread. The boys blinked at her in confusion at first, but then the shadows stirred, swirling like a tempest, and they finally began to understand that she would not let them stay. With shaking hands, Clara grabbed Ethan and Max and led them down the hallway. But just outside their room, the shadows thickened further, pulsating like a living tide. Clara pressed forward, the fear driving every step, pulling the boys along. The house seemed to groan under the weight of their fear. The walls whispered maliciously, recounting tales of despair and regret, filling the air with a heaviness that threatened to crush them. Clara dared a glance back toward the room and the window, where the darkened figure still lingered, watching, waiting, filled with an anticipation that sent chills down her spine. Every instinct in Clara screamed for her to flee the house, to escape the suffocating grip of the darkness. Yet, just as they reached the staircase, a loud thud echoed behind them, sending a shiver through her bones. She turned to see the door to the boys' room slam shut with a force that rattled the windows. Clara felt a scream clawing at her throat as she yanked on the boys, urging them to move faster. "Keep going. Don't look back," she cried, pushing them forward as adrenaline surged through her veins. The boys stumbled slightly but then found their footing as they raced down the hallway, hearts racing in sync with hers. As they reached the top of the stairs, Clara cast one last glance over her shoulder, and her heart sank. Shadows weaved like ribbons around the figure, its eyes glowing faintly, a sinister smile stretching across its dark visage as it beckoned with long, claw-like fingers. Panic surged through her, but she turned quickly, focusing only on the steps ahead. The air grew colder as they descended, each step feeling heavier, as if the house itself wanted to hold them prisoner. Why wouldn't it let them leave? Clara pushed down her rising fear, determined to get the boys to safety. They were her priority, and she would not let them become victims to this unholy presence. As they reached the front door, Clara grabbed the handle and found it cold to the touch, almost burning her skin. "It won't open," she gasped, heart racing wildly as she tugged hard against it, panic tightening its grip on her chest. The shadows swirled behind her, pressing in closer as the growling and laughter roared to life around them, a cacophony of dread that echoed through the air. Staring at the door, Clara felt desperation clawing at her mind. Then, grasping the doorknob tightly, she took a deep breath. "We can do this," she chanted under her breath, channeling all her love and strength into that single moment. "I won't let them take you." She yanked the door hard again, pushing with every ounce of her being. With a loud creak and a burst of warmth, the door finally flew open, spilling light into the encroaching shadows. The boys rushed past her into the expanse of night. Clara followed, the sudden rush of hope blending with a bitter taste of fear as the night air hit her like a wave. As they stood outside, Clara turned back to the house, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure at the window seemed to ripple, darkening as it foamed like a shadowy tide. The laughter faded, replaced by a quiet stillness that wrapped around her like a blanket of cold. The house loomed behind them, a monstrous silhouette against the starry sky, almost taunting. "Clara, what was that?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling, breaking the tension that had enveloped them. "We need to go now," she whispered, grabbing their hands tightly as they raced across the yard into the cool night, determined that they would outpace the horrors that awaited them within those walls. There was solace in the moonlight illuminating their path, each step away from the house filling Clara with a sense of purpose. But even as they fled, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was not finished with them yet. It lingered behind, whispering promises and threats, a haunting memory she would never forget. Clara dashed down the darkened hallway, her heart racing and her breath coming in quick gasps. A thick fog of despair wrapped around her, making the air feel heavy and cold. It felt like a weight, pressing against her chest, almost suffocating her. Behind her, the boys stumbled along, still groggy from sleep. Clara could see their wide eyes, filled with fear, darting around as the shadows twisted and wriggled in strange shapes. The house seemed alive, humming with a dark energy that sent shivers down her spine. "Come on, this way," Clara urged, her voice barely breaking through the thick, stifling darkness that wrapped around them. It was like the house was laughing at them, mocking their fear. The walls felt closer, as if they were leaning in to eavesdrop on their panic. As they neared the staircase, something strange happened. The shadows ahead grew darker and thicker, as if they were trying to wrap around Clara and her friends, blocking their path. Clara held Ethan and Max's hands tightly. Their warmth was a reassuring reminder of the friendship they shared and what she was fighting so hard to protect. Yet, the darkness felt insatiable, as if it wanted to consume everything in its path, turning light into shadow. Clara breathed deeply and steeled herself as she stepped onto the staircase, the old wood creaking beneath her feet. The sound echoed in the silence, amplifying her fear in a sinister symphony. Just then, a sudden gust of wind swept through the hallway as if the house itself were taking a big, deep breath. The front door flew open with a loud bang that made Clara jump. Her heart raced. Freedom was nearly tangible, so close she could almost reach out and grab it. But a voice inside her urged her to slow down, to think clearly before acting. "Stay close. Let's go," Clara shouted, her voice ringing out through the dark, even as the shadows around them began to claw at her limbs, whispering horrible truths in a language that sent icy chills down her spine. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, The shrill sound of the phone ringing cut through the chaos like a knife. Clara instinctively felt drawn to it, fought the overwhelming urge to answer. Every time she had picked up that phone, it had been a source of dread, bringing dark news that she wished she could forget. But Ethan and Max abruptly stopped, tugging on her arms desperately. "What if it's Mom?" Ethan asked, his face pale and tinged with the fear that now enveloped them. His innocent voice held a trembling quiver, full of uncertainty. "No," Clara nearly growled back, impatience flaring in her chest. "We have to keep moving." Despite the nagging pull of the phone, Clara could feel her heart racing, the sheer desperation wrapping around them like a thick blanket. The urgency of the moment propelled her forward, dragging the boys out into the living room. The moonlight spilled through the broken windows, creating dim pools of light that danced across the floor. But even that soft glow did little to banish the malevolence hiding like a predator in the corners of their sanctuary. Just as they reached the front door, Clara felt something cold press against her back, an icy tendril of darkness stretching toward her like a snake. She turned around, her eyes wide in horror, and saw it, a grotesque shape, its features twisted and malformed. Its body coiled along the walls, slithering with an unsettling grace, leaving behind a putrid stench that made her stomach churn. Waves of terror crashed over her, and she could barely breathe. The figure grinned wickedly, revealing long, jagged teeth that seemed far too large for its wretched, decaying face. "Time to play, Clara," it hissed, its voice echoing hauntingly around them. The boys stared, their innocent minds unable to comprehend the nightmare playing out before them. Clara could feel the weight of helplessness press down on her, crushing her spirit even more than the darkness itself. "Run!" she screamed, but Ethan and Max stood frozen, trapped by fear, unable to move, their eyes wide as saucers, flickering between the horrifying figure and her frantic attempts to break free. With her heart pounding, Clara drew on a burst of adrenaline and threw herself at the front door, desperate to escape the suffocating shadows that loomed behind her. She twisted the doorknob, pushing with all her strength, but it felt like the door was sealed shut by the very malevolence that surrounded them. "Open, please," she cried, her voice rising as panic surged within her. She pulled, pushed, and twisted the knob, but it remained stubbornly steadfast. "Clara," a soft whisper drifted through the air, not from the grotesque figure, but from deeper within the house, a voice that felt almost familiar. It called to her, summoning her to confront the dark, sinister truth of the night. The boys remained paralyzed at her side, their wide eyes flickering between the grotesque figure and her desperate efforts to escape. A sudden, heavy realization crashed over Clara like a thunderbolt, a grim understanding of what the old house truly wanted. It craved someone to torment, someone to ensnare in fear, someone it could claim as its own. The malevolent force surrounding them was not a mere prank, it was a predator, and they were the prey. Clara felt the truth settling over her, and it crushed her spirit, sending a chill through her very being. "Boys," Clara whispered, her resolve wavering as she turned to Ethan and Max. Their faces were pale, eyes wide and mouths agape in horror. "We have to stick together." In that moment, she understood that if they were going to escape, they could only do it as a team. The corners of the house breathed with a cruel life of their own, but she felt a flicker of determination. They would not be trapped here, not while they still had each other. The house craved their fear and sadness, but perhaps together they could try to fight back, to find a way out. But with each passing second, the darkness made it hard to discern what was real and what was just a trick of the sick and twisted shadows. As Clara pushed against the door with all her might, the creeping shadows tightened around them, wrapping her in their eerie embrace with an unbearable chill. Behind her, the grotesque figure laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that made her skin crawl, its cruel laughter sending shivers down her spine. Dread settled into her bones, and her heart hammered loudly, the beats echoing like a war drum in the chaos. She could sense the sinister force drawing closer, grasping at the edges of her strength. Taking one last deep breath, she summoned every bit of courage she could muster. "Let us go," she shouted defiantly, aiming every ounce of her will into the heavy force behind the door, but it was as if the shadows drank in her anger and fear. The shadows thickened even more, crawling forward, swallowing their screams and muffling their desperate pleas into a haunting cacophony of terror. The darkness loomed, a predator hungry to consume, ready to feast upon their struggles and turn them into hollow, empty shells. And in that dreadful moment, Clara recognized that she might have lost the battle against the malevolence that haunted the old Victorian house. Their fate had veered onto a dark, grim path, draining the last bits of hope as they slipped into the icy grip of shadows unholy and groaning, which lurked almost eagerly just beyond the fragile barriers of human understanding, a place where fear swallowed hope whole. The walls around them began to close in, tightening like a vice around their bodies, ensnaring Clara, Ethan, and Max in a web of despair that felt impossible to escape. Darkness swirled, wrapping around them as their hearts raced, desperate, beat after beat, echoing with the sounds of panic. All at once, they vanished into the realm of shadows, leaving only faint echoes of their frightened cries behind, a tormenting reminder of what had once been a home, now turned into a nightmarish prison. Yet, deep inside the dark corners of Clara's mind, in the very heart of despair, a glimmer of hope flickered weakly. They still had each other, and maybe, just maybe, together they could muster the courage to fight back against the shadows, to light a way out of darkness, even if it felt like a small chance. Clara felt the bond of friendship bind them, stronger than any darkness that threatened to surround them completely. Their journey was far from over. They would find a way to confront the shadows, for as long as they held onto each other, they weren't lost just yet.